This is chapter 18, Lady Margaret, of Stephen Vizinczey's novel, If Only. Lady Margaret. Jeremy Norton was the best man at Jim's wedding. They were both in their early 20s and they were both beginners at Microsoft. They had been writing the same lifts for weeks, but they actually started to speak to each other when they happened to share a table at lunchtime in the crowded Star of India restaurant on the ground floor of their building. Jim liked to listen and Norton liked to talk, and they got into the habit of lunching together fairly regularly. Well-born, well-connected, and penniless, Jeremy Norton had to work for a living. Tall and handsome, he was one of those large, burly men who are always ready to laugh. Way back then, he could even laugh at himself. Jim invited him to be best man at his wedding and afterwards invited him to dinner at their home. Subsequently, Norton invited the Taylors to dinner at a restaurant, but this remained their only social contact. Perhaps Jeremy Norton was put off by Leslie's critical eyes. She had said she never found it so hard to be friendly to anybody. But the two men got along fine at the Star of India. All this was so long ago that people could still smoke everywhere. Norton smoked in the restaurant even between courses, but he always turned his head away when he blew out the poison. His parents had invested in the insurance business through Lloyd's and had seen worldwide floods sweep away their fortune. They completed their financial ruin by sending their son to Eton, where he picked up many contacts which he continued to cultivate assiduously, playing tennis and riding horses with the rich. When he was a child, his parents owned a racehorse and they took him to the races. The horse was long gone, but he continued to go to Ascot every year and at times bet and won. When he lost, he borrowed several £100 from Jim. He always paid back the loans and swore he would return the favor one way or another. He never asked his old schoolfellows for money, nor would they have given him any. But they invited him to their parties to help fill the room, as he himself put it. He was looking for a beautiful girl attractive enough to screw even if she were poor, except she had to be rich. And if she ran the course in bed, he intended to marry her. He felt free to pour out his mind to Jim because he didn't think the Canadian would ever meet anybody from his social circles. There was no danger Jim would ever show up in a race box. Whatever he said to Jim, it could never reach anybody who mattered. They were lunchtime friends. One day, over the remnants of a curry, Norton announced that he had run into a possible victim at Ascot. "She's an aristocrat, and she's rich," he added, lighting a cigar and blowing the smoke toward the ceiling. "She's as tall as I am. I hate to bend down to girls. She probably feels the same way about bending down to small men. She's difficult, but we're the right height for each other." Difficult was too weak a word for Lady Margaret. She grew up on the ducal estate where servants and deferential tenant farmers treated the little girl with respect bordering on reverence. Even elderly people called her Lady Margaret, and children fell silent with envy when they learned who she was. By the time her father put her on her first pony, she had absorbed the conviction that she was superior to practically everybody outside her family. They don't even have a village named after them, was the sort of disdainful remark she had overheard as a child, It was as if there were only a few thousand able-bodied people in the country, and the rest were cripples. They were human beings, to be sure, the same sort of human beings as any duke or earl, often brighter and better persons, except, well, they were cripples. And even if all this hadn't turned her head, she would have acquired her sense of superiority from her brothers and sisters. All 6 children were convinced that they took after their father, the Duke, and slightly looked down on their mother, the daughter of a permanent Under Secretary of the Treasury. But still, a person who had to earn his living. Middle class. Little Lady Margaret knew that she was made of finer flesh. On her father's side, she had a 14th century ancestor who was beheaded for siding with the unsuccessful claimant to the throne, and a 15th century ancestor who got an earldom for ending up on the right side. A lane, a row, a street, a crescent, a road, a square in London, a town, and a whole region of England were named after her family, and it never occurred to her to doubt that she was a superior person, entitled to more consideration and fairer treatment than most people, which left her with a permanent sense of injustice, for consideration and fairness are in short supply in this world, even for the daughters of dukes. Life itself was unfair to her. She was thrown by her pony when she was only 4. Her shoulder bone and ribs healed, but she grew fatter no matter how she starved herself. "A lot of beautiful women are quite heavy, my darling," her mother said. "A lovely face, flawless skin, a husky voice, lively eyes, that's what beauty is. And you have all of that. Your voice alone will take you anywhere." Or she would say, "This is just puppy fat and you'll outgrow it." But how would her mother know? She was only middle class. But in the end, the middle-class Duchess turned out to be right. Lady Margaret had grown into a stunning beauty with a shapely, slender figure, and she only had to say yes to have all the sex she wanted. Yet life was still not what it ought to have been. Men were the worst. They were either rotten lovers or too pleased with themselves, and in either case they were childish. It would have been middle-class hypocrisy to pretend otherwise. None of them could take the least bit of truth or honesty, and she took pleasure in giving it to them in spades. There are women who can make men feel like gods. Lady Margaret could make them feel like worms. She had mellowed a bit by the time she started an affair with Norton. "She must be in her 40s, but you wouldn't know it," Norton boasted. "Any model would envy her long, slim legs, and when you feel her soft, white skin or her breasts, she could tell you she's 20-something and you would believe her. But she's desperate. Desperate to find a man who is worthy of her. She thinks nothing of flying thousands of miles for a ball or a dinner party." He lit a cigarette, filled his lungs with smoke, held it in for a few seconds with obvious pleasure, and blew it out sideways before going on. "It's stressful to be a duke's daughter, Jim. It's terribly stressful," he said, grinning. He had a big head and a wide mouth, and when he grinned, it was a big grin. Just think of it. The boys she played tennis with are ambassadors now, CEOs of big companies or heads of government departments. One became a cabinet minister. A recent one was a famous Hollywood actor. But these are just the high flyers I've heard about. There must have been others. But they didn't marry her. She's been playing, writing, dining, dancing, and fucking with important men for more than 20 years. She sees their names in the papers. They get married, they get divorced, they remarry, but it's always somebody else. A PA or a nurse or something like that. It's never her. "Poor woman," Jim commented. "She pays a high price for her ego." "Jim, Your wife's miscarriage made you sentimental. She is not a woman to feel sorry for. But why wouldn't anybody marry her? She would love to know why not. I tell her why not. But she doesn't believe me. She's the bossiest woman I've ever met. I wouldn't mind marrying her, though, she confessed. She's almost 20 years ahead of me, but the age difference could be a plus. It would make it easier for me to handle her. Have you proposed? There's no point. I'm not anybody important. Hardly an hour goes by without her using the word. It's very important for her to be important. It's essential. After all, if she can't be married to an important man, what's the point of having ancestors who were characters in Shakespeare's plays? What's the use of seeing her name on maps? Some of the most valuable real estate in the world is named after her family. I guess things like that would unhinge most women. In spite of Norton's skepticism about his chances, they finally got married. Norton regretted marrying her right after the wedding. Jim heard about it at the Star of India as soon as Norton came back from the honeymoon. The wedding ceremony was long and boring, and as soon as we got into the Bentley, I lit up. And you know what she did? She took the cigarette from my hand and threw it out of the car. He lit a cigarette defiantly and took a deep puff. She told me she couldn't stand the smoke. We'd been together for more than a year, Jim. I smoked 40 a day. I smoked even in bed, certainly every time after screwing, and she never once objected to it, not once. He stubbed his cigarette into the ashtray with such force it crumbled to bits. If she had breathed a single word against my smoking while I was still a bachelor, I'd never have married her. At the reception, she watched me like a hawk, and then think of the long plane ride. Once we got to the island, she allowed me to smoke outside our cottage, but that didn't last long. She started complaining that she couldn't stand the smell of tobacco on my skin. We spent most of our time in the open air. She must have tasted sea salt on me, but not cigarettes. When I told her off for talking nonsense, she replied that it was my mouth that stank, and she mentioned my skin because she didn't want to hurt my feelings. Norton fell silent as the waiter appeared, bringing the lamb tikka pasanda. Once they were alone again, Norton picked up his knife and fork and sighed, "If I couldn't cry on your shoulder, Jim, I'd explode." "So are you going to leave her?" Lowering his eyes to his plate, Norton fell to thinking. "Ask me that when you've waved away a fortune," he said after a long silence. "She tries to compensate. I have to grant her that," he added with almost a smile. He took a cigarette from his pack, looked at it, dropped it into the ashtray without lighting it. "Giving up smoking is pure hell, Jim, pure hell." "You'll live longer." "Well, there is that," sighed Norton. He was suffering torments of withdrawal and never ceased to complain about it until he disappeared, like someone who was run over or won the jackpot on the lottery. Rumor had it he had retired with his wife to her house on the ducal estate, or that they had gone on a tour of China or the Philippines or both. They were back in London when shares of the biggest UK computer company went into free fall. The new government had cancelled the launching of a national identity card, inflicting a loss of £5 billion worth of business on Quantum Systems, which had the contract to produce the software. As she hadn't been able to find an important man for herself, she decided to create one. She bought her husband enough QS shares to make him the largest individual shareholder in the company and secure him a seat on the board. QS outsourced to Microsoft the job of salvaging some of the discarded ID software for a new program integrating child protection services. The task fell to Jim. The reshaped program passed muster and QS was able to resell it to the government for $18 million. As a board member of QS, Jeremy Norton wrote to Jim congratulating him on his work. You're the top software man in the country. I hope we'll be a team one day. If this ever leads to anything, Jim said to Leslie, I'll owe it all to Lady Margaret, whom I've never met and who has probably never heard of me.